Marcus Chen was lost, and he knew it with absolute certainty as he stared at yet another identical corridor of shimmering blue crystal that seemed to stretch into infinity. The Valori Royal Palace was not designed for humans, and this became more obvious with every wrong turn he took and every confusing intersection that split into 3 or 4 different paths that all looked exactly the same to his very human eyes. He checked his translator device again, but the map function had stopped working 20 minutes ago when he wandered too deep into what he suspected was a restricted section of the palace. Ambassador Reyes was going to kill him if he missed the trade negotiation, and Marcus could already imagine the disappointed look on her face when he stumbled in late, covered in sweat, and completely unable to explain where he had been. This was his first interstellar assignment, and he was determined not to ruin it by getting lost like a child in a shopping center. He had trained for 3 years to earn this position, and he had studied Valori customs and language and diplomatic protocols until his brain felt like it might leak out of his ears, and yet nobody had thought to mention that the palace was essentially a giant maze made of materials that all reflected light in the exact same way. Marcus turned left because left felt right, and then he turned right because the corridor curved that way, and then he found himself standing before an enormous archway that pulsed with soft golden light. This looked important, and important usually meant he should stay away, but the archway also looked like it might lead somewhere he could ask for directions. He could hear music coming from inside and the sound of thousands of voices humming in harmony, and he figured this must be some kind of cultural event or celebration. The Valori loved their ceremonies and rituals, and Ambassador Reyes had mentioned something about a festival happening this week. So Marcus decided it would be fine to slip inside and find someone who could point him toward the east wing. He stepped through the archway and found himself at the top of a massive amphitheater that descended in circular tiers toward a central platform bathed in cascading light. Thousands of Valori filled the seats, and their luminescent skin glowed in shades of blue and silver and pale violet as they watched whatever was happening on the stage below. Marcus had never seen so many Valori in one place, and the effect was stunning. Like standing inside a galaxy made of living stars. On the central platform stood a single figure dressed in flowing robes that seemed to be made of liquid moonlight, as she moved with a grace that Marcus had never witnessed in any creature, human or otherwise. She was performing something that looked like a dance, but also like a prayer, and her arms traced patterns in the air that left trails of light hanging in space around her. Marcus knew he should leave because this was clearly not a casual event. But the music had changed, and everyone was sitting so quietly that any movement would draw attention to himself. He spotted an empty seat near the back of the amphitheater and decided that sitting quietly until the performance ended would be less disruptive than trying to sneak out now. He made his way down several steps and settled into the seat, and tried to make himself as small and unnoticeable as possible, which was difficult when he was the only creature in the room without glowing skin. The figure on the platform completed a series of movements and then stood perfectly still with her arms raised toward the ceiling. The humming from the crowd grew louder and then stopped abruptly. Marcus held his breath. A moment later, 2 Valori attendants appeared beside him, and Marcus nearly jumped out of his seat because he had not heard them approach. One of them held a chalice that glowed with the same golden light as the archway, and the other carried a small crystal shard on a velvet cushion. The attendant with the chalice offered it to Marcus with a deep bow. Marcus looked around nervously and wondered if this was some kind of refreshment offered to all guests. The attendants waited patiently, and the one holding the chalice gestured for him to drink. Marcus remembered his training about Valori hospitality and how refusing a gift was considered deeply offensive in their culture. He took the chalice and drank, and the liquid tasted like honey mixed with electricity and starlight, if such a thing were possible. The second attendant then pressed the crystal shard into his palm, and Marcus accepted it with what he hoped was a grateful smile. Both attendants bowed. Again, even deeper this time, and then retreated on the platform. The figure in moonlight robes had turned to face him, and even from this distance, Marcus could see that her eyes were wide with shock. The humming began again, but this time it built into something that sounded like a roar, and Marcus realized with growing horror that every single Valori in the amphitheater was now looking at him. The figure on the platform was Princess Selith, Viren, third daughter of the Valori Empress. Though Marcus did not know this yet, what Marcus also did not know was that he had just walked into the rite of eternal binding, which was the most sacred marriage ceremony in Valori culture. The rite worked like this, and had worked this way for 10,000 years without variation. The bride would perform the sacred dance and call out to the universe for a worthy soul to be her eternal partner. Whoever entered this sacred space during the calling and accepted the 3 gifts of presence and drink in token would become her bonded husband in the eyes of the ancestors. And all Valori law Marcus had entered during the calling. Marcus had accepted the drink. Marcus had accepted the crystal token. Marcus was now married to Princess Selith Viren. The crowd erupted into chaos, and Marcus sat frozen in his seat, with a glowing crystal clutched in his sweating palm, and absolutely no understanding of what had just happened. Princess Selith descended from the platform, and the crowd parted before her like water flowing around a stone. She walked up the amphitheater steps with slow, deliberate grace until she stood directly in front of Marcus. Her skin glowed pale silver, and her eyes were the deep purple of a dying star. And her expression combined fury and confusion, and something that might have been curiosity. She spoke in perfect English, because of course a princess would know the major languages of diplomatic importance. "What are you?" she asked. Marcus stood up because it seemed rude to remain seated, and he found that she was exactly his height, which somehow made everything more awkward. "I am Commander Marcus Chun," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on his own name. "Assistant to Ambassador Reyes of the Earth Diplomatic Corps, and I am very, very lost." Princess Selith stared at him for a long moment. "You are human," she said. "Yes," Marcus agreed. "You just became my husband," she said. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face, and the crystal in his hands suddenly felt very heavy. "I'm going to need you to explain that," he said, "because I think there has been a terrible mistake." The Empress's guards were already moving toward them, and Marcus had the distinct feeling that his first interstellar assignment had just become significantly more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The throne room of the Valori Palace was even more impressive than the amphitheater, and Marcus wished he could appreciate its beauty. Under circumstances that did not involve him potentially being executed, the Empress sat upon a throne carved from a single piece of black crystal that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, and her presence filled the room like a physical weight pressing down on everyone who stood before her. Marcus stood in the center of the room, flanked by guards whose weapons hummed with energy and whose expressions suggested they would very much enjoy using those weapons on him. Ambassador Reyes stood nearby, and her face had gone through several interesting colors in the past hour, starting with confusion and moving through anger and settling finally on a grim determination that Marcus found both reassuring and terrifying. Princess Selith stood apart from everyone else, and she had not spoken since they left the amphitheater, and her silence somehow felt louder than all the shouting happening around her. And there was a lot of shouting. Lord Kalthos was doing most of it, and he was a tall Valori with skin that glowed in angry red and armor that looked expensive and deadly in equal measure. "This is an insult to the crown," Lord Kalthos declared for perhaps the 5th time. "This creature invaded our most sacred ceremony and defiled the princess through his presence alone, and the only appropriate response is immediate execution." Marcus wanted to point out that he had not invaded anything and had simply been looking for a bathroom, or at least directions to one. but he suspected this was not the time for such clarifications. The human must die, Lord Kalthos continued, and then we must perform the rite again so that the princess may be properly bonded to her intended partner. The intended partner was of course Lord Kalthos himself, and Marcus was beginning to understand the source of the man's rage. Ambassador Reyes stepped forward, and her voice cut through the chaos with practiced diplomatic precision. Your Imperial Majesty, she said, the Earth Diplomatic Corps deeply regrets this incident, and we are prepared to offer significant concessions to resolve this matter peacefully. The Empress raised one hand, and the room fell silent instantly. The matter cannot be resolved, the Empress said, and her voice was cold and ancient, and carried the weight of 10,000 years of tradition. The rite of eternal binding was completed according to every requirement of our sacred law, and what the ancestors have joined cannot be separated by mortal hands. Lord Kalthos made a sound of strangled fury. Surely there must be some way, Ambassador Reyes pressed, some legal mechanism or ceremonial process that could annul this bond. There is one way, the Empress said, and her eyes moved to Princess Salith. My daughter could publicly declare herself unworthy of the ancestors' choice and admit that she failed in the sacred rite and accept that she is no longer fit to be called Vera. Princess Salith's head snapped up, and Marcus saw something flash in her purple eyes that might have been fear or might have been anger. Such a declaration would strip her of all titles and rights, the Empress continued. She would be cast out from the royal family and forbidden from participating in any ceremony or ritual for the rest of her life, and her name would be struck from the records of our house. That is acceptable, Lord Kalthos said quickly. I was not asking your opinion, the Empress replied, and Lord Kalthos flinched as if struck. Marcus understood now why Princess Salith had remained silent and why she looked like someone caught between two terrible options with no good path forward. The Empress turned her ancient eyes upon Marcus, and he felt suddenly very small and very human. You will be confined to the palace while we deliberate your fate, she said. You will have access to the guest quarters and the gardens, but you will not attempt to leave, and you will not attempt to contact your government without supervision. Your Majesty, Ambassador Reyes began. These are my terms, Ambassador, the Empress interrupted. Your assistant has bonded himself to my daughter, and until we determine how to proceed, he belongs to Valori jurisdiction. Marcus opened his mouth to protest, but Ambassador Reyes shot him a look that clearly communicated that he should remain silent if he wanted to continue. Living guards escorted Marcus from the throne room and through a series of corridors that he suspected he would never be able to navigate on his own, and finally to a suite of rooms that were beautiful and comfortable, and unmistakably a prison. He sat on a bed made of something softer than any material Earth had ever produced, and he stared at the crystal shard still clutched in his hand. He had not been able to let it go since the ceremony, and he was not sure if that was because of some magical compulsion, or simply because his fingers had cramped around it from stress. A door opened behind him, and Princess Salith entered without announcement or apology. Marcus jumped to his feet and nearly dropped. The crystal before his fingers tightened around it again. I came to see what manner of creature has ruined my life, she said, and her tone was flat and unreadable. I am so sorry, Marcus said immediately. I had no idea what was happening, and I was just trying to find the trade negotiation in the East Wing, and everything looks the same in this palace, and I thought it was a performance. Princess Salith studied him with those deep purple eyes, and her head tilted slightly to one side. You genuinely did not know, she said, and it was not quite a question. I genuinely did not know, Marcus confirmed. Is there some kind of form I can fill out to fix this, or maybe a process for diplomatic exceptions, or really anything at all that would help? Princess Salith stared at him for a long moment, and then something shifted in her expression that Marcus could not quite identify. You are not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? Marcus asked. A schemer, she said. A fool, who saw an opportunity for power and seized it without care for the consequences. I am definitely a fool, Marcus admitted, but not that kind of fool, and I promise you, I want to fix this just as much as you do. Princess Salith moved to the window and looked out at the crystal spires of the city below. Lord Kalthos will not wait for a diplomatic solution, she said quietly. He has wanted this bond for years, and he will not allow a human to stand in his way. What do you mean? Marcus asked. I mean that you should not drink anything that is not sealed, and you should not walk alone in the corridors, and you should not trust anyone who approaches you with kindness. She turned back to face him, and her expression had hardened into something that looked almost like concern. I did not want this bond, she said, but I also did not want to be bonded to Kalthos, and I find myself in the strange position of preferring an accidental human husband to a deliberate Valori one. That is oddly flattering, Marcus said. Do not die before we figure out how to resolve this, Princess Salith said, and then she left without another word. Marcus sat back down on the impossibly soft bed and wondered how his life had gone so wrong so quickly. Somewhere in the palace, Lord Kalthos was already planning his death, and Marcus had the uncomfortable feeling that his first interstellar assignment might also be his last. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus accidentally married an alien princess, and he was beginning to think that perhaps his situation was not entirely terrible. Valori law required bonded pairs to live in close proximity while any disputes about their union were being resolved, and this meant that Princess Salith visited his quarters every day for several hours at a time. At first these visits were awkward and filled with long silences and careful questions that danced around the obvious disaster they both found themselves in, but humans were adaptable creatures, and Marcus had always been good at finding common ground with people who seemed nothing like him. It started with music. Marcus had been humming an old song his grandmother used to sing, and Salith had frozen in the doorway with an expression of pure confusion. What is that sound? She asked. It is called humming, Marcus explained. Humans do it when we are thinking or when we want to remember something that makes you happy. The melody is strange, Salith said, but not unpleasant. Marcus pulled out his personal device and showed her recordings of Earth music, and he watched her face change as she listened to everything from classical symphonies to jazz, to the simple folk songs of his grandmother's village. Your species creates this, Salith said, and there was wonder in her voice that Marcus had not heard before. With such short lives you create such beauty. We create because our lives are short. Marcus said, we know we will not last forever, so we make things that might outlive us. Salith was quiet for a long time after that. The next day, she brought in recordings of Valori music, and Marcus listened to compositions that had been refined over thousands of years and passed down through hundreds of generations. The music was beautiful, but it was also perfect in a way that felt almost cold, and Marcus found himself missing the small imperfections of human performance. Your musicians do not make mistakes, he said. Mistakes are corrected and removed. Salith explained, only the perfect version survives. But sometimes the mistakes are the best part, Marcus said, and he showed her recordings of jazz improvisation where musicians deliberately played unexpected notes and created something new from the chaos. Salith listened with an intensity that Marcus was beginning to recognize as her version of fascination. They talked about many things in the days that followed. Marcus told her about Earth and its oceans that covered most of the planet, and the way the sun looked when it set over the water in colors that no crystal could capture. He told her about his grandmother who had raised him after his parents died in a transport accident, and how she had taught him that kindness was more important than cleverness, and that the measure of a person was how they treated those who could do nothing for them. He told her about human history with all its violence and stupidity, and also its moments of incredible courage and compassion. and he did not try to make his species sound better than they were. Salith listened to all of it, and in return she told him things she had never told anyone. She told him that being the third daughter meant being invisible and unimportant, and that she had spent her entire life being prepared for a political marriage that would benefit the empire. While her own wishes were never considered, she told him that she had studied xenobiology in secret because she wanted to explore the galaxy and discover new forms of life, and that this dream had been taken from her when she was chosen to bond with Lord Kelthos. She told him that she hated the palace and its endless ceremonies, and the way everyone smiled at her while calculating her usefulness. "You are the first person who has ever asked me what I want," she said one evening as they sat in the garden watching the 3 moons rise. "What do you want?" Marcus asked. Salith smiled, and it was a real smile, not the practiced diplomatic expression she wore in public. "I want to leave this place," she said. "I want to see the stars up close and study creatures no one has ever documented, and I want to make discoveries that matter." "That sounds like a good dream," Marcus said. "It is an impossible dream for a princess," Salith replied. "Nothing is impossible," Marcus said. "It is just sometimes very, very difficult." Salith looked at him with an expression he could not quite read, and they sat in comfortable silence until the moons had risen fully and the garden glowed with silver light. That night the assassins came. Marcus woke to the sound of his door being forced open, and he barely had time to roll off the bed before a blade sliced through the space where his head had been. There were 3 of them, and they moved with a speed and precision that marked them as professional killers. Marcus had no combat training and no weapons, and he was certain that he was about to die. Then Salith was there. She had come through a connecting door that Marcus had not known existed, and she moved like liquid lightning with a blade in each hand that she had apparently been carrying the entire time. The first assassin fell before he even knew she was there, and the second lasted only moments longer. The third assassin was faster and more skilled, and he managed to evade Salith's initial strike and counter with a thrust aimed at her heart. Marcus did not think, he simply moved. He threw himself between Salith and the blade and felt cold fire tear through his shoulder as the weapon meant for her found him instead. The assassin pulled back for another strike, but Salith was already moving, and her blade found his throat before he could complete the motion. Marcus collapsed to the floor, and the world went blurry and dark around the edges. Salith knelt beside him, and her hands pressed against his wound, and her voice was saying things that Marcus could not quite understand. "Why did you do that?" she demanded, and there was something in her voice that sounded almost like fear. "Why would you do that for me?" Marcus tried to answer, but the darkness was pulling at him, and the last thing he saw before consciousness fled was the glow of Salith's skin and the shine of tears in her purple eyes. He had not known that Valori could cry in the days that followed while Marcus recovered in the medical wing. Salith rarely left his side. She did not speak much, but her presence was constant, and when Marcus finally woke fully, she was there holding his hand with an expression that had changed in ways neither of them had words to describe. Something had shifted between them, and they both knew it even if they were not yet ready to name it. They were not in love, but they were something else now, and that something felt more important than either of them had expected. Marcus was still recovering from his wounds when Lord Kalthos made his move. The assassination attempt had been traced back to mercenaries, with no direct connection to anyone in the court, and without solid evidence, the noble remained untouchable and free to continue his schemes. But Kalthos had grown impatient, and he was done with subtle approaches that could be denied or deflected. He stood before the Empress in the great throne room with hundreds of witnesses present, and he invoked an ancient rite that had not been used in over 1,000 years. "I demand trial by stellar combat," Lord Kalthos declared, and his voice echoed through the crystal chamber. "I challenge the human Marcus Chun for the bond of Princess Salith Viren." The court erupted into shocked whispers, and Marcus felt his stomach drop through the floor. He had been reading about Valori customs during his recovery, and he knew exactly what trial by stellar combat meant. Two opponents would face each other in single combat until one of them could no longer continue, and the winner would claim whatever prize had been contested. In this case, the prize was Salith. Marcus looked at Lord Kelthos and saw a warrior who had been training for combat since before humans had developed space travel. Kelthos was taller and stronger and faster than any human could hope to be, and he had centuries of experience with every weapon the Valori had ever created. Marcus had once gotten winded walking up 4 flights of stairs when the elevator in his apartment building broke down. The human must accept or forfeit, Lord Kelthos said, and there was cruel satisfaction in his voice. If he forfeits, then the bond is dissolved, and the princess becomes mine. By right of his cowardice, Marcus understood the trap immediately. If he refused to fight, he would lose. Salith to a man who had already tried to kill them both, and she would spend the rest of her very long life bound to someone who saw her as nothing more than a political prize. If he accepted the challenge, he would almost certainly die. He looked across the throne room to where Salith stood with her royal family, and he saw the fear in her eyes and the desperate plea for him to refuse and save himself. He thought about his grandmother and what she would say. If she could see him now, she would tell him that some things were worth fighting for even when you knew you could not win. She would tell him that courage was not about being unafraid, but about doing the right thing even when you were terrified. She would tell him that the universe had a way of rewarding those who stood up for others, even when standing up meant falling down. I accept the challenge, Marcus said, and his voice was steady, even though his hands were shaking. The court fell silent. Lord Kelthos smiled like a predator that had just cornered its prey. The trial will take place in 30 days, the Empress announced, and her voice betrayed nothing of what she thought about this situation. The human will be given that time to prepare. 30 days to learn how to fight against a warrior who had been perfecting his skills for longer than human civilization had existed. Marcus was fairly certain that was not enough time. Salith found him in the garden that evening, and her face was a storm of emotions that Marcus was only beginning to learn how to read. You should have refused, she said. You should have let me go to him and saved yourself. I could not do that, Marcus said simply. Why not? Salith demanded. You barely know me and you owe me nothing, and now you are going to die because of a bond that neither of us chose. Marcus considered her question carefully before he answered. Because you deserve better than him, he said. Because you have dreams that matter and a mind that could change the galaxy, and I will not be the reason those things are taken from you. You are a fool, Salith said, but there was no anger in her voice. You mentioned that before, Marcus agreed. But I am a stubborn fool, and that has to count for something. Salith was quiet for a long moment, and then she straightened her shoulders, and her expression shifted into something that looked almost like determination. I will train you, she said. You know how to fight? Marcus asked. I know many things the princesses are not supposed to know, Salith replied, and I will teach you everything I can in the time we have. The training began the next morning, and it was brutal. Salith pushed Marcus harder than he had ever been pushed in his life, and she did not accept excuses or complaints or any of the very reasonable arguments he made about human physical limitations. She taught him how Valori warriors moved, and how they thought, and where their techniques had weaknesses that could be exploited. She taught him forms and stances and patterns that his body screamed in protest against learning. Marcus was terrible. He was slow and clumsy, and his reflexes were laughably inadequate compared to any Valori opponent. But he did not quit. Every time Salith knocked him down, he got back up. Every time she pointed out a mistake, he tried to correct it. Every time his body begged him to stop, he pushed through and kept going. The days blurred together into an endless cycle of training, and rest and more training. Marcus improved from catastrophically bad to merely completely outmatched. He went from lasting 3 seconds against Salith to lasting almost a full minute. He learned to read his opponent and anticipate attacks and find the smallest openings in seemingly perfect defenses. He was still going to lose. They both knew it, but something had changed in the way Salith looked at him, and there was a light in her eyes now that had nothing to do with her bioluminescent skin. One evening, after a particularly grueling session, Salith sat beside him in the garden and watched the moons rise, just as they had done weeks before. "Why do you keep getting up?" she asked quietly. "You know you cannot win, and yet you refuse to stay down." "Because giving up is not something I know how to do," Marcus said, "and because every time I get up, I see you watching me, and I think, maybe that is reason enough." Salith did not respond with words. Instead, she reached out and took his hand in hers, and her skin was warm against his palm, and her fingers intertwined with his like they belonged there. They sat together in the moonlight, and neither of them spoke about what was coming, but both of them understood that whatever happened in the trial, they would face it together, and that was worth more than either of them had expected to find in this strange accidental bond that had brought them together against all odds. The arena was packed with more Valori than Marcus had ever seen gathered in one place, and every screen across the Empire was broadcasting the trial of Stella. Combat Marcus stood at one end of the circular fighting floor and tried to remember how to breathe. Lord Kalthos stood at the other end, and he was magnificent in ceremonial armor that had been polished until it gleamed like captured starlight, and his weapons were ancient and deadly, and had probably ended more lives than Marcus wanted to think about. Marcus wore a borrowed combat suit that did not quite fit properly, and his weapon was a standard training blade that Salith had helped him choose. He looked like exactly what he was, which was a completely outmatched human. Facing impossible odds, the Empress rose from her observation throne, and the crowd fell silent. This trial of stellar combat has been called to determine the validity of the bond between Princess Salith Viren and the human Marcus Chun. She announced Lord Kalthos has challenged that bond in Commander. Chun has accepted the challenge. Marcus found Salith in the crowd, and she was sitting with her family, and her face was carefully composed, but her eyes told him everything she could not say out loud. She was afraid for him. She believed in him. She loved him. That last realization hit Marcus like a physical blow, and he understood suddenly that he loved her too. Not because of magic or ancient rituals or diplomatic obligations. He loved her because she was brilliant and brave and kind. Beneath her royal mask, he loved her because she had dreams that deserved to come true. He loved her because she had taught him to fight even knowing it would not be enough. He loved her because she was Salith, and that was reason enough. The trial will continue until one combatant yields or is unable to continue, the Empress declared. Begin. Lord Kalthos moved like lightning. His first strike came faster than Marcus could track, and it was only Salith's training that saved him as his body reacted before his mind could catch up. He blocked and dodged and retreated, and every movement cost him ground and energy that he could not afford to lose. Kalthos was toying with him, and they both knew it. The Valori Lord was faster and stronger and better in every measurable way, and he wanted the crowd to see exactly how outmatched his opponent truly was. Marcus took a hit to his ribs and felt something crack. He took another hit to his leg and stumbled. He took a slash across his arm that painted the arena floor with red, human blood. The crowd watched in silence as the inevitable conclusion approached, but Marcus did not stay down every time Kalthos knocked him to the ground. He pushed himself back up. Every time his body screamed at him to yield, he refused to listen. He bled and bruised and broke, and still he kept fighting, because during all those weeks of training, Marcus had not only been learning combat, he had also been reading every night after Salith left him to rest. He had pulled up the ancient texts of Valori law and studied them with the same dedication his grandmother had taught him. To bring to anything important, he had read about the Rite of Eternal Binding and its 10,000 years of history. He had read about trial by stellar combat and the countless warriors who had fought and died in this very arena. And buried deep in the oldest records, he had found something that everyone else had forgotten: the clause of worthy sacrifice. It was a provision written into the original trial laws by the first Valori sages, and it stated that a bonded partner who willingly faced death to protect their bondmate's honor had proven themselves worthy beyond any challenge, regardless of the outcome. The trial did not require victory. It required the willingness to die. And Marcus had walked into this arena knowing he could not win. He had accepted the challenge knowing it meant his death. He had done it anyway because Salith was worth dying for. Lord Kalthos raised his blade for what would clearly be the killing blow, and the crowd held its breath. "I invoke the clause of worthy sacrifice," Marcus said, and his voice was broken but clear. The arena fell into shocked silence. "That clause has not been invoked in 3,000 years," Lord Kalthos snarled. "It does not matter how long it has been." Marcus replied, "The clause exists, and I have met its requirements, and by the oldest laws of your people, my bond with Salith is proven beyond challenge." Kalthos turned to the Empress, and his expression demanded that she reject this claim. The Empress gestured, and a group of legal scholars hurried forward to consult the ancient records. Marcus knelt on the arena floor and focused on not passing out from blood loss while they deliberated. The head scholar finally straightened and addressed the Empress. "The human speaks true," he said. "The clause of worthy sacrifice is valid and binding, and by its terms Commander Chun has proven himself worthy, and the bond is confirmed." The crowd erupted into chaos. Lord Kalthos screamed something that Marcus's translator refused to process, and he raised his blade as if to strike anyway. "Lord Kalthos," the Empress said, and her voice cracked like thunder, "you will lower your weapon." Kalthos hesitated. "Furthermore," the Empress continued, "evidence has been provided to this court that connects you to the assassination attempt on my daughter and her bonded partner, and you will surrender yourself for trial." Ambassador Reyes stepped forward from the crowd, and beside her stood Salith with a data tablet in her hands and a fierce smile on her face. They had been working together for weeks. All those times Salith had sat by his bedside, she had not only been caring for him, she had been coordinating with the human diplomatic corps to build a case that would finally bring Kalthos to justice. Guards surrounded the Valori Lord, and he was led away screaming threats that no one cared to acknowledge. Marcus tried to stand and found that his legs had decided they were done supporting his weight for the day. Salith reached him before anyone else, and her arms wrapped around him, and she did not seem to care that his blood was staining her royal robes. "You beautiful, impossible fool," she whispered. "You're beautiful, impossible fool," Marcus corrected her. Salith laughed, and it was the first time he had ever heard her truly laugh, and the sound was better than any music either of their species had ever created. In the medical wing later that evening, after his wounds had been treated, and the doctors had marveled at how much damage one human could survive, Marcus woke to find Salith sitting beside him. "The Empress has officially recognized our bond," she said. "You are now a member of the royal family, whether you like it or not." "I think I can live with that," Marcus said. "She also granted me permission to pursue my studies in xenobiology," Salith continued, and there were tears in her eyes. She said that any family that included a human who would die for her daughter was clearly unconventional enough to allow an unconventional princess. Marcus smiled and reached for her hand. "Does this mean you will finally get to see the stars up close?" he asked. "We will see them together." Salith said, "I have already requested a research vessel, and the Empress has agreed to provide one." She leaned down and kissed him, and the kiss contained everything neither of them had been able to say since this strange journey began. When she pulled back, Marcus looked at her glowing face and her purple eyes and her smile that had once seemed so cold but now felt warmer than any sun. "I walked through the wrong door," he said. "Did you?" Salith asked. Marcus thought about everything that had happened since that day in the crystalline corridors, when he had been looking for a trade, negotiation, and had found something infinitely more valuable. "No," he said finally. "I think for the first time in my life I walked through exactly the right door." Salith squeezed his hand, and the 3 moons of Kethsora rose outside the window, and their light painted the room in silver and hope and the promise of a future that neither of them had ever dared to dream of. But now they would dream it together, and that was worth more than all the wrong doors in the universe.